You're listening to the Cybercrime and Business Podcast, the weekly podcast that's focused exclusively on how the world of cybercrime is impacting business. This episode is brought to you by SurfWatch Labs. SurfWatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on. Hello everybody out there. Today is November 21st, 2014. I am Jeff Peters, editor of HackSurfer.com. I'm here with Matt Lichtfuss, HackSurfer writer, and Eric Severson, SurfWatch Labs data analyst. A little bit later at the end of the podcast, we'll be playing an interview with Stuart Itkin. He is the CMO of ThreatTrack Security, and they just did a study about some of the surprising attitudes that IT security professionals have heading into 2015. To kick off the discussion this week, I think I'll get right into the most interesting story that I found in the HackSurfer community. It was actually an article that was posted yesterday about the SurfWatch Labs Cybercrime C-Suite report. And that's sort of, I'd say, is probably the most interesting report that I read every month in terms of cybercrime, because there's, just with so much going on and so many stories and all the stuff that we're reading, it's kind of easy to sort of get lost, kind of the forest from the trees kind of thing. And that report every month, just kind of looks at the high level risk facing each industry. So just a couple key points I found in there, and then I can sort of kick it over to you guys, see if there's anything interesting you thought. Consumer goods, entertainment, healthcare, other organizations, and industrials, those 5 sectors all had above average risk in October. And SurfWatch Labs measures risk by, what actors are attacking, what effects are happening, what practices are happening in the sector, who's being targeted, things like that. But one of the most interesting aspects about that report is you can actually sort of compare the risk level to the level of discussion that's kind of happening within those industries. Even though healthcare, entertainment, and industrials all have above average risk, they also had below average discussion. It's just kind of interesting to see what industries and what targets are sort of going under the radar compared to what's the actual risk facing any industries. So yeah, Eric, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if there's any interesting stories that stood out to you on HackSurfer this week.
Well, you're right. Things like industrials and healthcare just aren't as flashy, so they don't get as much press as, new photo leaks or credit card theft. So you definitely don't get the whole picture just by reading the regular news. For instance, everyone has been talking about this webcam website supposedly set up in Russia that you can log into and see any unsecured webcam from around the world. They've scoured the internet for those. And now it's getting all this attention, and governments are putting all this pressure on Russia to shut it down, which I think is at the best useless because they're unsecured webcams. The worst part is that they're using default passwords. Shutting down a website that looks at them isn't going to help anything. We really need to address the bigger issue of changing your passwords when you set up an external device of any kind.
Yeah, I guess, Matt, sort of looking at the data and stuff this week, is there any interesting things, or what's everyone, I guess, talking about in HackSurfer and other places?
Well, probably the top story that I've noticed people talking the most about, there's a story coming around the Ku Klux Klan. Obviously, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with Ferguson, Missouri, what's going on out there with protests and everything. And the Ku Klux Klan put out a memo pretty much saying that they're going to use lethal force against any protester, that has anything to say that would be bad against their agenda. Well, Anonymous, for, kind of how they do, they took offense to it and wanted to act against them. So they took over 2 of their Twitter handles. They took them down, so they seized control, and they said that anyone that was going to say anything promoting the Ku Klux Klan, they were going to disrupt that so no one could see it. So that's what's going on in the news this week with the Ku Klux Klan. A lot of people are talking about it. Jeff, you and I actually wrote articles about it. If anyone wants to check that out, it's on HackSurfer.com. We were discussing Anonymous's role and kind of taking different views. I used a pro view and try to make it, I guess, talk about the patriotic sense of duty. And Jeff took the anti-side to that. And actually, I mean, I'll let you talk about it, Jeff, but I mean, it definitely wasn't what I was saying about Anonymous, that's for sure.
Well, yeah, it was actually kind of funny. I wrote, I mean, I was a little tongue-in-cheek as well, but I posted that, and then on Twitter someone told me I completely missed the point of Anonymous, which could possibly be true because I know nothing about Anonymous. I'm not really in Anonymous, but, just looking at it from the outside, and not that, you want to come out pro-KKK, obviously, but Anonymous has all these causes, and they're so wide, they're so varied, in terms of geography and in terms of what they're trying to get done and in terms of membership. So I think, my whole point was, as a group, I would say I'm probably, against what Anonymous does. Just because you look at something, they launched something like Op Israel, and, they're going to take down the Israeli government. But really, what do? They DDoS a few sites, they end up disrupting the bakery on the corner. It's not like they do anything grand in a lot of cases. And in a lot of cases, small businesses are sort of getting caught in the crossfire of these things. And then looking at, even the Ferguson case, they actually identified the wrong police officer. So the wrong cop, and his family is sort of getting death threats and things like that. They post pictures of police officers' families. There's another case earlier this year where they're posting information, about jurors in a case that they didn't agree with. And, obviously it's fine to disagree with the verdict, but why would you post jurors' home addresses and things like that, unless you just want them to get harassed? I mean, I don't really understand the point of what they do sometimes. And obviously it's a varied group, but, that was just sort of where I was coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing I would say, I mean, I tend to get a little patriotic about things, but I mean, I think when we were talking about this earlier this week, you made a point to me that kind of made me start seeing things a little differently. And what you said was, let's say me and you wanted to be part of Anonymous. Well, guess what? We could go do something and we're anonymous. What they're doing, really, it doesn't take like any type of membership or any type of qualifications. You could have some average Joe with some agenda, I mean, what if maybe today they don't like the vendor at like a football stadium, so they want to go on there and, I'm doing this and I'm part Anonymous to make this guy look bad because there was an injustice done. I mean, I kind of see your point with all of that. I mean, what is that really proving? So that kind of it takes down their credibility with me too, now that I think about it.
I find it interesting, value judgment aside, that the KKK Anonymous story has sort of taken over the news about what it started over. The grand jury case that should be ostensibly releasing its findings any time now has sort of fallen to the side as everyone's focusing on this side battle. So
yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I guess that's sort of my biggest beef with hacktivists in general, is that they always say they're about some sort of cause, but at least to me from the outside, it always seems like it ends up being more about them and more about the hacking and more about the glory of, what they're doing rather than the actual cause. So
yeah, they take the attention rather than the thing they're supposedly acting about.
Yeah,
I do have to say that I was sorry, Jeff. I was excited to hear. Maybe it's just because of my hatred of the Ku Klux Klan, but I was excited to hear that someone stood up against them. But having said that, yeah, I mean, there's so many other things that could be done that would be more righteous. And
yeah, that's such a controversial stance to stand against the KKK. Like, I think it's kind of more interesting when someone like the ACLU supports the KKK for their free speech. That someone takes that counterintuitive stance, and the one that doesn't always feel good.
I think there was a lot happening in the government sector this week, Matt. Could you maybe fill us in on what you saw?
Yeah, and this was really, this kind of shocked me a little bit. This week there were 4 government sector related targets in the top 10 most discussed targets for the week. We had the U.S. State Department, USPS, NOAA, the Executive Office of the President of the United States. All 4 of these were tagged within the top 10 most discussed targets for the week. So what's going on with the government sector? I mean, why are these being discussed so heavily?
I know, actually, all those 4 are actually in the top 6, not just the top 10. Like, almost all of our top targets are those government ones. And I think part of it, the reason it gets so much attention is that the government usually gets held to a higher standard. Like these are the top guys, or they should be. Maybe they should be more secure. Same happens with banks. Like, this is important. Maybe you should be good at what you're doing. And all of these have been fairly important attacks too. Like, real data is stolen. The USPS, got a lot of sensitive information about the employees. U.S. State Department emails. Like, this isn't a DDoS on some random Department of Commerce site. Like, this is some pretty significant information stolen.
Yeah, and to follow up on Eric's point, I think the government sector, looking at the data, always has probably, it's always in the top in terms of, the number of targets that are, that are being hit, each week, each month, each year, et cetera. But I think, this week, or, the past couple weeks even, we've just seen those targets, rather than it being, a hacktivist DDoS in a website, or, some sort of vandalism, on a website, something like that. I think the impact of the attacks, like with the Postal Service or the State Department, for example, is just more. And just kind of looking at the data, I kind of dug around a little bit just to see, how much discussion was in the government sector. And I thought it was pretty interesting because if you look at the fourth quarter so far, 15% of all the cybercrime discussion has been in the government sector. But if you look at just the past week, 35% of all the cybercrime discussion from the past 7 days was in the government sector. So obviously a lot of people are talking about the government sector with these stories out there. I guess one interesting thing that I found kind of related to government was there was a story a few days ago where the city of Detroit, the mayor, he was talking about how one of their city databases got attacked and they were demanding 2,000 bitcoins, which is like, $800,000, I think, approximately. Obviously, they didn't pay that much money. That'd be a lot, but they said they didn't even need the database. So they weren't too concerned necessarily about it being locked. But another interesting thing that I saw was Dixon County in Tennessee, I believe, they actually admitted to paying a CryptoLocker ransom, which I think is kind of interesting because you hear a lot about this CryptoLocker and you hear a lot about ransomware, but you don't really hear too often about people actually admitting to paying it. And this was, a government official admitting that they paid a ransom. So I got a quote from him here. He said, this is Jeff McCliss, the Dixon County Sheriff's Office IT director. And he said what happened was basically their files got locked. He said every sort of document that you could develop in an investigation was in that folder. And there was a total of 72,000 files. And the interesting question, I guess, to ponder is he says, is it better to take a stand and lose all that information or to make the payment and grit your teeth and just do it? So they ended up making the payment. It was only $500. But I just thought that was kind of interesting because pretty much all the IT people we talk to, they basically say, they always advise against making those payments.
But really, who tries to get $800,000 out of Detroit? Isn't that city broke anyway?
Yeah, I thought that was a lot. And I guess it kind of goes to the point which a lot of the people we've been talking to is saying that's why they offer this small amount. They offer $500 or $100 or $200 because that's an amount that people would actually pay. Obviously, thousands is a different story.
Yeah, you lower the price enough and it becomes more expensive to lose the information or to solve it a different way.
And I think I'd agree with that because, really, if you're not prepared, you don't have your files backed up and you need the information, for me, that'd be a tough call. What would you do? I know a lot of security professionals say don't pay it, but if you need the information and you didn't do your due diligence and make sure you were prepared and protected for it, what do you do? That's been my biggest question with that.
Well, I think the biggest issue with paying, though, is that obviously if you pay, what's to say they're not going to, you're obviously were vulnerable in the first place. What's to say they're not just going to do it again and charge you for more money? So I think the important thing is making sure you have a backup of all your stuff.
Yeah, some of the vanilla crypto or ransomware has been pretty basic. That's all it does. But there's some that's starting to do key logging and stealing other data. So that family of malware could be evolving and getting nastier. Meanwhile, it's worth checking, for instance, CryptoLocker, if that's the one that's hit you, a lot of researchers, or some researchers actually kind of broke that one. So you may be able to recover it otherwise. Check before you pay if you really need to pay.
Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, moving on, is there any other interesting stories before we kind of wrap up this discussion?
Yeah, this is a story that's not being discussed, and it's just quick information. There was a new development with it. Staples has finally come out. A spokesperson said, yeah, acknowledging, yeah, we were breached. But that's really all the information he gave about it. The spokesman didn't even mention the 100 stores. He just said, yeah, there was a breach. We're looking into it. It's pretty much all he said. Well, Staples has about 2,000 stores worldwide. They got about 1,800 here in the United States and Canada. So it's just one of those stories. You don't know how big the breach could be. And I'm surprised not more people are talking about this. So I was just wondering why this isn't being heavily discussed, and just kind of pointing out that no one from Staples is really giving a whole lot of information.
I cover consumer goods at SurfWatch. I pay attention to these especially, and it's true, not much has been coming out about it. We're still in sort of the early stages, not a lot of information available. And it doesn't seem to have been nearly as massive as something like Target or Home Depot, and so you take that and combine it with the overall, breach fatigue, that it's so hard to care about all of these one after another, that might be what's, keeping it from making so many headlines. The most interesting thing, I think, is that, as it was confirmed, Brian Krebs also has some sources that are linking the attackers behind the Michaels craft store breach to the Staples breach, that they were using some of the same command and control servers. The information was going to, it looks like, the same place, and it's the only two of these big retail breaches that have been that explicitly connected to one another. So there's been a lot of speculation as to who's behind these, and some connection like that between two of these big ones is, I think, quite significant. Probably the most important thing about this story so far.
Yeah, what I find really interesting, sort of from a business perspective, is that when these breaches happen, kind of like you mentioned, both you guys, is that a lot of the information ends up coming from people like Brian Krebs or, the New York Times, rather than from the company themselves. I think these companies, they want to make sure they know what happened before they speak about it, but I think in a lot of cases, you could argue for it's good to sort of get ahead and kind of take on the story rather than let all these sort of news outlets kind of shape the story for you and, break all the news.
Yeah, this has been in the headlines and the spotlight for about a year now. I'm surprised so many companies are so wrong about the playbook. There's a pretty standard responding to a data breach model now that involves transparency and openness and quickness, and yet certain companies just don't seem to get it. And you're right, I think, I don't have the figures with me, but it's something like 90% of data breaches in consumer goods are reported to the company from an outside source, like law enforcement or a bank or something like that. They aren't finding their own problems. I just don't get how a full year after this, the problems are still so fundamentally the same. So.
Yeah, and it seems like, as we've discussed in some of our webinars, and I think even last week, is just basically the cyber criminals have found a method that works, and they just keep kind of running the same play again and again and again, and I think they're going to keep doing that until people figure out how to defend against it.
Which has obviously not been the case.
Yeah, so moving on, we got our cyber tip of the week. I think, Matt, you were doing an interview the other day, and you spoke to someone who kind of had some good information out there.
Yeah, I interviewed Mark Seward. Seward is the Vice President of Marketing at Exabeam, so I'm going to quote him here. Pay closer attention to the way your computer is behaving. Not all glitches that you see belong to Microsoft or Apple. So any of those types of things you see could really be related to some sort of virus or a piece of malware on your system, or some sort of person who is actually taking over your system and working on it at the same time you are. So when you see something that is abnormal for your system, don't be afraid to report that to the IT help desk or a security professional in your company or organization. I thought that was a pretty neat tip to share with everybody.
Yeah, and I think it's important, obviously from an individual standpoint, if you notice something interesting on your computer, it's good to look into it. But I think from a business standpoint, obviously you want to make sure your employees are aware of that, and you have a sort of an open kind of relationship where you can, if employees are sensing something's up with their computer or it's running slow, make sure that they know that they should be, reporting that, so you guys can catch malware and things that might be in the system. Because in a lot of cases, the employees are really the front lines. Everyone talks about the technology and all these, advanced sort of techniques to catch malware. But in a lot of cases, it's simply employees being smart, knowing about cybersecurity and being aware and sort of being that front line of defense. All right, that'll do it for this week's discussion. Now we have an interview with Stuart Itkin, the CMO of ThreatTrack Security, where we discuss their new survey, 2015 Predictions from the Frontlines. Yeah, so I know you guys over at ThreatTrack, you just made a survey of 250 IT security professionals, and I guess the surprising thing to me is that 81% of enterprise security staffers will personally guarantee their company's customer data will be safe in 2015. That seems pretty surprising to me. I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Well, I think the important thing is that in spite of the optimism that that organizations have shown, it's important that they not be lulled into a false sense of security. I mean, if this year was any indication, certainly the bad guys aren't going away. I think perhaps a number of things may have affected their feelings. However, certainly the visibility of breaches and cyber attacks in 2014 have certainly put this front and center as a boardroom issue, and it seems that organizations are now taking the advice of CISOs, taking the advice of security teams more seriously. That was one of the key results that we found within the results of the study. So if there's a silver lining that came out of all of the issues that existed within 2014, it's perhaps that organizations are really now paying attention at the level they should and appreciating the risk associated with cyber attack, and they're paying attention to the professionals that they've brought in to those roles to be able to really deal with those things. And it wasn't that organizations felt that the attacks were going away. I mean, in fact, that if we look at the data, 68% of the respondents really feel that their organizations are more likely to be victims, they're more likely to be attacked, but they certainly feel that they are much better protected going into 2015, and so that the impact of those attacks are certainly going to be minimized. Or maybe put another way, they feel that they know more people are going to be shooting at them, they know they may be using better bullets, but they feel that they've certainly got better defenses and are better prepared than they have been in the past.
I definitely find that interesting, just the level of confidence out there, especially given 2014. I guess the one thing on my mind is, as I've interviewed and we've talked to people at HackSurfer, all the security experts tend to kind of say the same thing, which is, you can't stop everything. You got to expect that something's going to get through. You're going to get breached. Something like that is kind of sort of a theme. But then here in this study, we have these people kind of saying that they're going to personally guarantee that the data is going to be safe. So in my mind, there's kind of like two different things there. You got some people guaranteeing things, and then you got all these other experts saying, well, never guarantee anything. Something's always going to get through. So I'm just curious if you can kind of make sense of that in my mind for me.
Well, I think that what they're saying is that they certainly feel that they are better equipped to be able to deal with the issues. One of the messages that that certainly came through loud and clear is that organizations feel that they're better able to deploy the scarce resources that exist within organizations. I think it's been well established, that security teams, really don't have all the people they need, and that they never will. But organizations have been making investments in areas that are either going to enable them to detect things earlier, and so the ability to employ technology that's going to enable somebody to recognize when somebody's trying to break into the house, so that they can be stopped as opposed to a lot of the existing technology that is there that is simply telling them, hey, we just realized that your house was broken into and that perhaps something had gotten stolen. So it's a little bit of a stitch in time, being able to save nine, so to speak, being more effective in deploying the resources that exist, as well as looking at investments in other technology that are just going to enable organizations to better prioritize responses and better prioritize the use of analysts. So I think that what we're seeing is just a general sense of optimism overall, that organizations recognizing that they're going to continue to be targets. In fact, they're going to be targets more in 2015 than they were in 2014, but feeling that, one, they're better prepared to be able to deal with this, and second, feeling that they're certainly getting the attention of the executive management in their organizations that may not have been there in the past. And that's kind of what we see these results saying.
In addition to sort of the confidence level, and sort of there's a little bit in the study about people with CISOs in their organizations kind of had more confidence and were making more investments. But in addition to kind of that's kind of like the high level theme, I guess I'd say, is the confidence. Is there anything else sort of within the study that maybe kind of stands out to you that you want to chat about?
Well, I think, again, and you brought up an important point about CISOs, and certainly organizations that have CISOs appeared to be more aware, more realistic about the risk and the level of breaches that have occurred, but they also seem to be more confident than those that didn't have CISOs in their ability to deal with those things. And it could be a little bit of the chicken and the egg. Was it the CISO that caused this, the organizations to be more sensitive, or were they more security savvy organizations that brought in a CISO? And whether it's the chicken or the egg, what's clear is that no one can afford to play chicken with cyber criminals.
Another interesting thing that I guess stood out to me was, especially at HackSurfer, we always like to look at the different industry sectors, because obviously cybercrime varies widely depending on what sector you're looking at. And you guys pointed out the financial and healthcare sectors had the lowest responses, just in terms of like that personal guarantee about data security. I think finance was 64% and 73% for healthcare. So it's still significant optimism, but I mean, those two sectors were the lowest. Do you have any kind of thoughts on why healthcare and the financial sector were maybe the lowest in terms of that response?
The data, there wasn't specific data in terms of the why in the study. I think the two things that we've seen in other data that we've looked at, is certainly financial services are on the end of the high risk spectrum, and so that if anything, they know that they're going to be shot at even more than other organizations. And healthcare certainly, from a vulnerability and an exposure standpoint, certainly a lot of the changes, a lot of the things that have been going on in healthcare, the maturity of those systems and the kind of the risk of PHI, I think just has health organizations far more sensitized to the issue, probably far more focused on it, but perhaps, like we found with organizations that have CISOs, they just have a better understanding of the risks and the problem.
Yeah, one other thing I wanted to get your thoughts on is, in the study, I recognized that I think it was one of the top concerns, maybe it was the top concern, was people just kind of being overwhelmed with, alerts and kind of putting a lot of time and energy into sort of tracking down, these threats. And that's something that I guess in everyone I talk to, we tend to hear a lot about, I think even with like some of the retail breaches, security teams are maybe getting thousands of alerts, and sometimes they're ignoring important ones. So I'm just kind of wondering, with that sort of being a theme, if you kind of maybe have any insight into like how to solve that problem, or what security people need to be doing to sort of, I guess, overcome that.
So that message came through very loud and clear. As organizations have implemented defense in depth, adding more and more solutions, each and every one of those solutions is generating alarms. It's shouting, "I found something, here it is." And the challenge is being able to really discern those things that are representative of true attacks. And if you look at a targeted attack and an advanced persistent threat, it's not an alert that is coming through, but it's really a pattern that's being developed, perhaps targeting a specific individual or a group within an organization, and trying it with malware of escalating sophistication. I identify my target, I try something, that didn't work, let's try something else, let's try something else. Those are the patterns that, that I think new technologies and solutions are being able to identify, and really providing the opportunity for organizations to recognize, hey, somebody's trying to break into your house now, so that you can sound the alarm and stop that intrusion from occurring. And so that's, we heard that people are concerned that they're hearing more and more alerts, but also looking at technology that's going to enable them to kind of put the pieces together to identify the patterns, to recognize anomalies ahead of time, to be able to really put a stop to things before they affect the organization. Again, it's a stitch in time, saving 9. Saving the impact to the organization, but also being able to deploy those very, very valuable security resources more effectively.
I guess one other aspect that was in the survey was they were just talking about sort of top concerns, and I think advanced persistent threats, kind of as you mentioned, was one of them, but also spear phishing, targeted malware attacks. So I guess over at HackSurfer we kind of try to sort of simplify cybersecurity as much as we can. So, if anyone like from a business is listening and they sort of want to improve their security on those fronts, could you maybe just talk a little bit about like what kind of options are out there to maybe stop those kind of threats?
Well, certainly. I mean, we're seeing focus on technology that is really looking at discerning patterns and to identify active programs to be able to again prevent something from occurring, identifying it before it's had an impact, to really affect the organization. You look at the statistics out of the most recent breach report, talking about on average, I believe it's 64 days for an organization to recognize that it's even been breached. Well, if you can move that forward, literally to the point where you're knowing when somebody is trying to get in, as opposed to learning after the fact that they've gotten in, that's that's certainly a huge impact. I think education is one of the things we've heard as well, which is, again, helping organizations be and feel more secure and recognizing, and this is what's coming out of the CISOs, of bringing an understanding within their organizations that security is really as much a governance issue and an organizational issue as it is a technology issue. And so by heightened awareness, heightened participation, and better training, organizations are better positioned to deal with many of these issues.
Then one final question I had just kind of to close out this discussion is, also in the survey, and I think you brought it up earlier, 68% also said that their companies are more likely to be targeted. So clearly everyone's sort of expecting, this trend of more cyber attacks and more malware and targeted attacks to continue. Obviously, the IT people in the survey feel fairly confident. I'm just kind of wondering your thoughts sort of on the overall landscape, kind of heading into the holiday season and the new year. If you think, companies are really coming around and becoming more secure, if you still think there's a long ways to go.
Well, so I think the one thing that we can take away from this, maybe two things, is certainly the bad guys aren't going away. The attacks are going to escalate and become increasingly more sophisticated. So organizations clearly need to continue to be more diligent. You just don't dig a moat and say, hey, it's done, we've got the bad guy, we'll keep the bad guys out. And so the recognition that things, there will be more attacks, they will get more sophisticated. Organizations need to remain diligent, but at the same time, I think what the results are telling us is that organizations are really listening and taking this far more seriously, investing more time, investing more dollars, and really being more conscious of cyber type of issues and cybersecurity.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time, Stuart. We appreciate it.
Well, certainly. I appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
That's it for episode number 2 of the Cybercrime and Business Podcast. Big thanks to ThreatTrack Security's Stuart Itkin for joining us, and also to SurfWatchLabs.com for providing us with all the risk analysis and data that we talk about each week. For more information, check out HackSurfer.com and subscribe to us on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you listen.